If you grew up with a PlayStation, chances are you played Toy Story 2. Maybe you rented it for a weekend from Blockbuster or Video Easy. Maybe you owned a copy that sat right next to Crash Bandicoot and Spyro on your bedroom shelf. Or maybe you only played it at a friend's house and, like many of us, didn't manage to get very far. Whatever the case, there's a good chance the game occupies a very specific corner of your memory. When people talk about Toy Story 2 today, they usually remember the movie first. Then, if the game comes up at all, it's often remembered as one of those surprisingly decent licensed platformers from the late 90s, a fun adaptation that managed to be better than most movie tie-ins of its era. And honestly, that's how I remembered it too, a charming little platformer with colourful levels, familiar characters, and enough Pixar magic to keep kids like myself back then entertained for a few afternoons. But while researching this video, I started noticing something that my childhood memories had completely glossed over. Toy Story 2 wasn't just a good licensed game, it was a surprisingly demanding one. The further I looked into it, the more I was reminded of the awkward camera angles, the lengthy levels, the precise jumps, and the constant risk of losing progress after just a simple careless mistake. Like a lot of childhood games, time has a way of smoothing over those rough edges. We remember the excitement of exploring Andy's house or racing through Al's toy barn, but we forget the frustration that came with navigating those spaces. Beneath its colourful PS1 Pixar presentation was a platformer that could be surprisingly stressful, surprisingly unforgiving, and far more difficult than many of us actually remember. One of the strangest things about revisiting childhood media is realizing how much of it exists in our heads rather than in reality. Over time, memories stop behaving like accurate recordings and start behaving like highlight reels. We remember the things that excited us, surprised us, or made us feel something, while everything else slowly faded into the background. That's especially true with retro video games. Years after we have put the controller down for that very last time, we tend to remember the worlds more than the mechanics, the atmosphere more than the challenge it brought, the feeling of playing more than the reality of actually progressing through the game. It's why so many childhood favorites seem larger than life in retrospect. The details over time become blurry, but the emotions still remain. And when we eventually look back at those games years later, we're often comparing the real experience to a version of it that only exists in memory. Toy Story 2 benefits from this effect more than most of its games from its era. For many players, the game isn't remembered as a collection of objectives, collectibles, and platforming challenges. It's remembered as an adventure, an opportunity to explore giant bedrooms, climb towering bookshelves, navigate toy stores, and experience familiar locations from an entirely different perspective. Everything felt enormous because Buzz was tiny. Every room felt packed with possibilities because the game constantly encouraged curiosity. Combined with the popularity of the movie itself, those memories created a powerful sense of nostalgia that has only grown stronger over time. When people talk about Toy Story 2 today, they're usually talking about how much they loved being inside the world. They're remembering the fantasy. What tends to get overlooked is the amount of work the game required from players, especially of a young age, in order to fully experience it. Part of that comes down to the era in which the game was released. The late 90s were filled with platformers that assumed players would be willing to struggle. Developers expected people to get lost. They expected players to miss jumps, overlook objectives, and spend time figuring things out through trial and error. Modern games often go out of their way to prevent frustration, constantly pointing players toward the next objective and smoothing out potential roadblocks before they become problems. Toy Story 2 belongs to a completely different school of design. It throws players into large levels, gives them a general objective, and largely expects them to figure out the rest themselves. That approach creates a stronger sense of discovery, but it also creates opportunities for confusion, frustration, and failure. Looking back, it's surprising just how much freedom the game gives players, especially considering it was marketed primarily towards children. And that's where the disconnect between memory and reality begins to emerge. When people remember Toy Story 2, they remember the excitement of exploring Andy's house, the thrill of discovering hidden areas, and the satisfaction of collecting enough tokens to unlock the next stage. What they don't always remember are the missed jumps that sent them back to the start of a section, the camera angles that occasionally fought against them, or the moments where progress came to a complete stop because they couldn't figure out what the game wanted them to do next. Those frustrations haven't disappeared from the game itself, they've simply been erased by time. The more you closely examine Toy Story 2 for the PlayStation 1, the more obvious it becomes that beneath its colourful Pixar exterior was a platformer that demanded patience, persistence, and a surprising amount of skill. And once you start noticing those demands, it's hard not to wonder whether the game was a lot tougher than we ever gave it credit for. One of the biggest reasons Toy Story 2 has remained so fondly remembered is the sheer scale of its environments. The game understood something that many licensed titles of the era didn't. If you're going to put players into the world of a beloved movie, you need to make that world feel worth exploring. Rather than building small, linear stages that simply recreated scenes from the film, Traveller's Tales took a much more ambitious approach. Everything in Toy Story 2 is designed around Buzz's size. Andy's house isn't just a level, it's an entire environment transformed by perspective. A bookshelf becomes a towering structure, a desk becomes a platforming challenge, a bedroom becomes a sprawling landscape filled with secrets, obstacles, and hidden objectives. It's the kind of design that immediately captures a child's imagination because it takes them to safe and familiar spaces and makes them feel extraordinary. Even now, 20 plus years later, it's often the first thing people remember about the game. Not a boss fight, not a specific mission or side mission, the feeling of being a toy in a world built for humans. What childhood memories tend to leave out is how much of these environments demanded from players of such young ages. Toy Story 2 wasn't content with simply letting players admire its levels, it wanted them to learn them, to understand them, to navigate them efficiently. Progress often required exploring every corner of a stage, talking to the characters, locating hidden objectives, collecting enough Pizza Planet tokens, and solving problems that weren't immediately obvious. Unlike many modern games, there was rarely a glowing marker pointing towards the next objective or a constant stream of hints reminding players what to do. The game trusted players to pay attention to their surroundings and figure things out on their own. That design philosophy creates a stronger sense of discovery, but it also means players could spend long stretches of time wandering around without making meaningful progress. For adults, that's usually a minor inconvenience. For children, it could be the difference between completing a level and getting utterly completely stuck. This is where Toy Story 2 starts to reveal itself as something more demanding than its reputation suggests. At first glance, it looks like a straightforward platformer, designed primarily for younger audiences, but beneath its colourful presentation is a game built around exploration and observation just as much as jumping and combat. Many objectives required players to revisit areas they've already explored, notice environmental details that previously ignored, or figure out how the seemingly disconnected parts of a level can fit together. The game frequently asked players to think about space in 3 dimensions, keeping track of locations above, below, and behind them while navigating environments that often feel much larger than they actually are. That's part of what makes the game rewarding, but it's also part of what made it so stressful. The challenge wasn't always mechanical. Sometimes the challenge came from simply understanding what the game expected of you in the first place. Looking back, it's hard not to admire how ambitious this approach was for a licensed game released in 1999. Most movie tie-ins were designed to be disposable experiences that rode the popularity of a film before quickly fading into obscurity. Toy Story 2 aimed higher. It wanted players to immerse themselves in its worlds, learn their layouts, uncover their secrets, and spend time mastering spaces rather than simply moving through them. The result is a game that feels far richer than many of its contemporaries, but also one that demands significantly more from its audience than people often remember. Beneath the familiar Pixar characters and cheerful presentation lies a platformer that consistently asked players to engage with it on its own terms. And while that ambition is a major reason the game is still remembered so fondly today, it's also one of the reasons revisiting it reveals a level of difficulty that childhood nostalgia has largely erased. In the years since its release, Toy Story 2 has earned its reputation as one of those rare licensed games that genuinely surpassed expectations of the era, and that reputation is deserved. It is creative, ambitious, surprisingly large in scope, and captures the spirit of the movie better than most adaptations ever could. But looking back on it today reveals another side of the game that's easy to forget. Beneath the colourful visuals and familiar characters was a platformer that expected players to explore, experiment, and persevere. It didn't smooth over every rough edge. Instead, it trusted players to learn its worlds for themselves, even if that occasionally led to constant frustration. What many of us do remember as a simple childhood adventure was, in reality, a much more demanding experience than we often gave it credit for. And maybe that's part of the reason Toy Story 2 has remained so memorable all these years later. The challenge made the victories feel earned. The scale made the world feel believable. The moments that frustrated us as children became the moments we still remember as adults. It's easy to look back at games through the lens of nostalgia and assume they were simpler than they really were. But Toy Story 2 is a reminder that some childhood favorites were asking far more of us than we realized at the time. And while memory may have softened those rough edges, they are still there if you look closely enough. Hidden beneath the Pixar charm is a platformer that was surprisingly stressful, surprisingly ambitious, and surprisingly difficult. And for that reason alone, it's a game worth remembering to infinity and beyond.